Welcome to Classic Literature Free Audiobooks. Today, we delve into The House on the Borderland by William Hope Hodgson, a foundational piece of literature that has captivated imaginations since its publication. Settle in, clear your mind, and let the rich tapestry of this tale unfold around you. Now, let the story begin with The House on the Borderland. Chapter 14, The Sea of Sleep. For a considerable period after the last incident which I have narrated in my diary, I had serious thoughts of leaving this house, and might have done so, but for the great and wonderful thing, of which I am about to write how well I was advised, in my heart, when I stayed on here, spite of those visions and sights of unknown and unexplainable things. For had I not stayed, then I had not seen again the face of her I loved. Yes, though few know it, none now save my sister Mary, I have loved and me. Lost, I would write down the story of those sweet old days, but it would be like the tearing of old wounds. Yet after that which has happened, what need have I to care? For she has come to me out of the unknown. Strangely, she warned me passionately against this house, begged me to leave it, but admitted when I questioned her that she could not have come to me had I been elsewhere. Yet, in spite of this, still she warned me earnestly, telling me that it was a place long ago given over to evil and under the power of grim laws of which none here have knowledge. And I just asked her again whether she would come to me elsewhere, and she could only stand, silent. It was thus that I came to the place of the Sea of Sleep, so she termed it in her dear speech with me. I had stayed up in my study, reading, and must have dozed over the book. Suddenly I awoke and sat upright with a start. For a moment I looked round with a puzzled sense of something unusual. There was a misty look about the room, giving a curious softness to each table and chair and furnishing. Gradually, the mistiness increased, growing, as it were, out of nothing. Then, slowly, a soft, white light began to glow in the room. The flames of the candles shone through it palely. I looked from side to side, and found that I could still see each piece of furniture, but in a strangely unreal way, more as though the ghost of each table and chair had taken the place of the solid article. Gradually, as I looked, I saw them fade and fade, until slowly they resolved into nothingness. Now I looked again at the candles. They shone wanly, and even as I watched, grew more unreal, and so vanished. The room was filled now with a soft yet luminous white twilight, like a gentle mist of light. Beyond this I could see nothing. Even the walls had vanished. Presently I became conscious that a faint, continuous sound pulsed through the silence that wrapped me. I listened intently. It grew more distinct, until it appeared to me that I harked to the breathings of some great sea. I cannot tell how long a space passed thus, but after a while it seemed that I could see through the mistiness, and slowly I became aware that I was standing upon the shore of an immense and silent sea. This shore was smooth and long, vanishing to right and left of me in extreme distances. In front swam a still immensity of sleeping ocean. At times it seemed to me that I caught a faint glimmer of light under its surface, but of this I could not be sure. Behind me rose up, to an extraordinary height, gaunt black cliffs. Overhead, the sky was of a uniform cold grey colour, the whole place being lit by a stupendous globe of pale fire that swam a little above the far horizon and shed a foam-like light above the quiet waters. Beyond the gentle murmur of the sea, an intense stillness prevailed. For a long while I stayed there, looking out across its strangeness. Then, as I stared, it seemed that a bubble of white foam floated up out of the depths, and then, even now I know not how it was, I was looking upon, nay, looking into the face of her. Aye, into her face, into her soul. And she looked back at me with such a commingling of joy and sadness that I ran toward her, blindly, crying strangely to her in a very agony of remembrance, of terror, and of hope to come to me. Yet, spite of my crying, she stayed out there upon the sea and only shook her head sorrowfully. But in her eyes was the old earth-light of tenderness that I had come to know before all things ere we were parted. At her perverseness, I grew desperate and essayed to wade out to her. Yet though I would, I could not. Something, some invisible barrier held me back, and I was fain to stay where I was and cry out to her in the fullness of my soul, "Oh, my darling," but could say no more for very intensity. And at that she came over swiftly and touched me, and it was as though heaven had opened. Yet, when I reached out my hands to her, she put me from her with tenderly stern hands, and I was abashed. Next chapter, the fragments do, the legible portions of the mutilated leaves. Through tears, noise of eternity in my ears, we parted, she whom I love. Oh, my God, I was a great time dazed, and then I was alone in the blackness of the night. I knew that I journeyed back once more to the known universe. Presently I emerged from that enormous darkness. I had come among the stars, vast time. The sun, far and remote, I entered into the gulf that separates our system from the outer suns. As I sped across the dividing dark, I watched steadily the ever-growing brightness and size of our sun. Once, I glanced back to the stars and saw them shift, as it were, in my wake, against the mighty background of night. So vast was the speed of my passing spirit. I drew nigher to our system, and now I could see the shine of Jupiter. Later, I distinguished the cold, blue gleam of the earthlight. I had a moment of bewilderment. All about the sun there seemed to be bright objects moving in rapid orbits. Inward, nigh to the savage glory of the sun, there circled two darting points of light, and further off there flew a blue, shining speck that I knew to be the earth. It circled the sun in a space that seemed to be no more than an earth minute, nearer with great speed. I saw the radiances of Jupiter and Saturn spinning with incredible swiftness in huge orbits, and ever I drew more nigh and looked out upon this strange sight, the visible circling of the planets about the mother sun. It was as though time had been annihilated for me, so that a year was no more to my unfleshed spirit than is a moment to an earth-bound soul. The speed of the planets appeared to increase, and presently I was watching the sun, all ringed about with hair-like circles of different-colored fire, the paths of the planets, hurtling at mighty speed about the central flame. The sun grew vast, as though it leapt to meet me, and now I was within the circling of the outer planets, and flitting swiftly toward the place where the earth, glimmering through the blue splendor of its orbit as though a fiery mist, circled the sun at a monstrous speed. Next chapter, chapter 16, The Awakening. I awoke with a start. For a moment I wondered where I was. Then memory came to me. The room was still lit with that strange light, half sun, half moon light. I felt refreshed, and the tired, weary ache had left me. I went slowly across to the window and looked out. Overhead, the river of flame drove up and down, north and south, in a dancing semicircle of fire. As a mighty sleigh in the loom of time it seemed, in a sudden fancy of mine, to be beating home the picks of the years. For so vastly had the passage of time been accelerated that there was no longer any sense of the sun passing from east to west. The only apparent movement was the north and south beat of the sun stream that had become so swift now as to be better described as a quiver. As I peered out, there came to me a sudden, inconsequent memory of that last journey among the outer worlds. I remembered the sudden vision that had come to me as I neared the solar system of the fast whirling planets about the sun, as though the governing quality of time had been held in abeyance, and the machine of a universe allowed to run down an eternity in a few moments or hours. The memory passed, along with a, but partially comprehended, suggestion that I had been permitted a glimpse into further time spaces. I stared out again, seemingly at the quake of the sun stream. The speed seemed to increase, even as I looked. Several lifetimes came and went as I watched. Suddenly, it struck me with a sort of grotesque seriousness that I was still alive. I thought of Pepper and wondered how it was that I had not followed his fate. He had reached the time of his dying and had passed, probably through sheer length of years. And here was I, alive, hundreds of thousands of centuries after my rightful period of years. For a time I mused absently. Yesterday, I stopped suddenly. Yesterday, there was no yesterday. The yesterday of which I spoke had been swallowed up in the abyss of years, ages gone. I grew dazed with much thinking. Presently, I turned from the window and glanced round the room. It seemed different, strangely, utterly different. Then I knew what it was that made it appear so strange. It was bare. There was not a piece of furniture in the room, not even a solitary fitting of any sort. Gradually, my amazement went as I remembered that this was but the inevitable end of that process of decay which I had witnessed commencing before my sleep. Thousands of years, millions of years. Over the floor was spread a deep layer of dust that reached halfway up to the window seat. It had grown immeasurably whilst I slept, and represented the dust of untold ages. Undoubtedly, atoms of the old, decayed furniture helped to swell its bulk, and somewhere among it all mouldered the long-ago dead Pepper. All at once, it occurred to me that I had no recollection of wading knee-deep through all that dust after I awoke. True, an incredible age of years had passed since I approached the window, but that was evidently as nothing, compared with the countless spaces of time that, I conceived, had vanished whilst I was sleeping. I remembered now that I had fallen asleep sitting in my old chair. Had it gone? I glanced toward where it had stood. Of course, there was no chair to be seen. I could not satisfy myself whether it had disappeared after my waking or before. If it had mouldered under me, surely I should have been waked by the collapse. Then I remembered that the thick dust which covered the floor would have been sufficient to soften my fall, so that it was quite possible I had slept upon the dust for 1,000,000 years or more. As these thoughts wandered through my brain, I glanced again, casually, to where the chair had stood. Then, for the first time, I noticed that there were no marks in the dust of my footprints between it and the window. But then, ages of years had passed since I had awaked, tens of thousands of years. My look rested thoughtfully, again upon the place where once had stood my chair. Suddenly I passed from abstraction to intentness, for there, in its standing place, I made out a long undulation, rounded off with the heavy dust. Yet it was not so much hidden, but that I could tell what had caused it. I knew and shivered at the knowledge. that it was a human body, ages dead, lying there, beneath the place where I had slept. It was lying on its right side, its back turned toward me. I could make out and trace each curve and outline, softened and molded, as it were, in the black dust. In a vague sort of way, I tried to account for its presence there. Slowly, I began to grow bewildered, as the thought came to me that it lay just about where I must have fallen when the chair collapsed. Gradually, an idea began to form itself within my brain, a thought that shook my spirit. It seemed hideous and insupportable, yet it grew upon me steadily until it became a conviction. The body under that coating, that shroud of dust, was neither more nor less than my own dead shell. I did not attempt to prove it. I knew it now, and wondered I had not known it all along. I was a bodiless thing. A while I stood, trying to adjust my thoughts to this new problem. In time, how many thousands of years I know not, I attained to some degree of quietude, sufficient to enable me to pay attention to what was transpiring around me. Now I saw that the elongated mound had sunk, collapsed, level with the rest of the spreading dust, and fresh atoms, impalpable, had settled above that mixture of grave powder which the eons had ground. A long while I stood, turned from the window. Gradually I grew more collected, while the world slipped across the centuries into the future. Presently I began a survey of the room. Now I saw that time was beginning its destructive work, even on this strange old building. That it had stood through all the years was, it seemed to me, proof that it was something different from any other house. I do not think, somehow, that I had thought of its decaying, though why I could not have said. It was not until I had meditated upon the matter for some considerable time that I fully realized that the extraordinary space of time through which it had stood was sufficient to have utterly pulverized the very stones of which it was built, had they been taken from any earthly quarry. Yes, it was undoubtedly mouldering now. All the plaster had gone from the walls, even as the woodwork of the room had gone many ages before. While I stood in contemplation, a piece of glass from one of the small diamond-shaped panes dropped with a dull tap amid the dust upon the sill behind me and crumbled into a little heap of powder. As I turned from contemplating it, I saw light between a couple of the stones that formed the outer wall. Evidently, the mortar was falling away. After a while, I turned once more to the window and peered out. I discovered now that the speed of time had become enormous. The lateral quiver of the sunstream had grown so swift as to cause the dancing semicircle of flame to merge into and disappear in a sheet of fire that covered half the southern sky from east to west. From the sky, I glanced down to the gardens. They were just a blur of a palish, dirty green. I had a feeling that they stood higher than in the old days, a feeling that they were nearer my window as though they had risen bodily. Yet they were still a long way below me, for the rock over the mouth of the pit on which this house stands arches up to a great height. It was later that I noticed a change in the constant color of the gardens. The pale, dirty green was growing ever paler and paler toward white. At last, after a great space, they became grayish-white and stayed thus for a very long time. Finally, however, the grayness began to fade, even as had the green, into a dead white, and this remained constant and unchanged. And by this I knew that at last snow lay upon all the northern world, and so, by millions of years, time winged onward through eternity to the end of which, in the old earth days, I had thought remotely, and in hazily speculative fashion. And now it was approaching in a manner of which none had ever dreamed. I recollect that about this time I began to have a lively, though morbid, curiosity as to what would happen when the end came. But I seemed strangely without imaginings. All this while, the steady process of decay was continuing. The few remaining pieces of glass had long ago vanished, and every now and then a soft thud and a little cloud of rising dust would tell of some fragment of fallen mortar or stone. I looked up again to the fiery sheet that quaked in the heavens above me and far down into the southern sky. As I looked, the impression was borne in upon me that it had lost some of its first brilliancy, that it was duller, deeper hued. I glanced down once more to the blurred white of the worldscape. Sometimes my look returned to the burning sheet of dulling flame that was, and yet hid the sun. At times I glanced behind me into the growing dusk of the great, silent room with its Ian carpet of sleeping dust. So I watched through the fleeting ages, lost in soul-wearing thoughts and wonderings, and possessed with a new weariness. Next chapter, chapter 17, the slowing rotation, it might have been 1,000,000 years later, that I perceived, beyond possibility of doubt, that the fiery sheet that lit the world was indeed darkening. Another vast space went by, and the whole enormous flame had sunk to a deep copper color. Gradually it darkened from copper to copper red, and from this at times to a deep, heavy, purplish tint. Within it a strange loom of blood. Although the light was decreasing, I could perceive no diminishment in the apparent speed of the sun. It still spread itself in that dazzling veil of speed. The world, so much of it as I could see, had assumed a dreadful shade of gloom, as though in very deed the last day of the worlds approached. The sun was dying. Of that there could be little doubt. And still the earth whirled onward, through space and all the eons. At this time, I remember, an extraordinary sense of bewilderment took me. I found myself, later, wandering mentally amid an odd chaos of fragmentary modern theories and the old biblical story of the world's ending. Then, for the first time, there flashed across me the memory that the sun, with its system of planets, was, and had been, traveling through space at an incredible speed. Abruptly, the question rose, where? For a very great time I pondered this matter, but finally, with a certain sense of the futility of my puzzlings, I let my thoughts wander to other things. I grew to wondering how much longer the house would stand. Also, I queried to myself whether I should be doomed to stay bodiless upon the earth through the dark time that I knew was coming. From these thoughts, I fell again to speculations upon the possible direction of the sun's journey through space. And so another great while passed gradually, as time fled. I began to feel the chill of a great winter. Then I remembered that, with the sun dying, the cold must be, necessarily, extraordinarily intense. Slowly, slowly, as the eons slipped into eternity, the earth sank into a heavier and redder gloom. The dull flame in the firmament took on a deeper tint, very sombre and turbid. Then, at last, it was borne upon me that there was a change. The fiery, gloomy curtain of flame that hung quaking overhead and down away into the southern sky began to thin and contract, and in it, as one sees the fast vibrations of a jarred harp string, I saw once more the sun-stream quivering, giddily, north and south slowly. The likeness to a sheet of fire disappeared, and I saw plainly the slowing beat of the sun-stream. Yet even then the speed of its swing was inconceivably swift. and all the time the brightness of the fiery arc grew ever duller. Underneath, the world loomed dimly, an indistinct, ghostly region. Overhead, the river of flame swayed slower and even slower, until at last it swung to the north and south in great, ponderous beats that lasted through seconds. A long space went by, and now each sway of the great belt lasted nigh a minute, so that after a great while I ceased to distinguish it as a visible movement, and the streaming fire ran in a steady river of dull flame across the deadly-looking sky. An indefinite period passed, and it seemed that the arc of fire became less sharply defined. It appeared to me to grow more attenuated, and I thought blackish streaks showed, occasionally. Presently, as I watched, the smooth onward flow ceased, and I was able to perceive that there came a momentary but regular darkening of the world. This grew until, once more, night descended in short but periodic intervals upon the wearying earth. Longer and longer became the nights, and the days equaled them, so that at last the day and the night grew to the duration of seconds in length, and the sun showed once more like an almost invisible coppery-red coloured ball within the glowing mistiness of its flight, corresponding to the dark lines showing at times in its trail. There were now distinctly to be seen on the half-visible sun itself. Great, dark belts year after year flashed into the past, and the days and nights spread into minutes. The sun had ceased to have the appearance of a tail, and now rose and set, a tremendous globe of a glowing copper-bronze hue, in parts ringed with blood-red bands, in others with the dusky ones that I have already mentioned. These circles, both red and black, were of varying thicknesses. For a time, I was at a loss to account for their presence. Then it occurred to me that it was scarcely likely that the sun would cool evenly all over, and that these markings were due, probably, to differences in temperature of the various areas, the red representing those parts where the heat was still fervent, and the black those portions which were already comparatively cool. It struck me as a peculiar thing that the sun should cool in evenly defined rings, until I remembered that possibly they were but isolated patches, to which the enormous rotatory speed of the sun had imparted a belt-like appearance. The sun itself was very much greater than the sun I had known in the old world days, and from this I argued that it was considerably nearer at nights. The moon-6 still showed, but small and remote, and the light she reflected was so dull and weak that she seemed little more than the small, dim ghost of the olden moon that I had known. Gradually, the days and nights lengthened out until they equaled a space somewhat less than one of the old earth hours, the sun rising and setting like a great, ruddy bronze disk crossed with ink-black bars. About this time I found myself able once more to see the gardens with clearness, for the world had now grown very still and changeless. Yet I am not correct in saying gardens, for there were no gardens, nothing that I knew or recognized. In place thereof, I looked out upon a vast plain stretching away into distance. A little to my left, there was a low range of hills. Everywhere, there was a uniform white covering of snow, in places rising into hummocks and ridges. It was only now that I recognized how really great had been the snowfall. In places it was vastly deep, as was witnessed by a great, upleaping, wave-shaped hill away to my right, though it is not impossible that this was due in part to some rise in the surface of the ground. Strangely enough, the range of low hills to my left, already mentioned, was not entirely covered with the universal snow. Instead, I could see their bare, dark sides showing in several places, and everywhere and always there reigned an incredible death silence and desolation. The immutable, awful quiet of a dying world. All this time, the days and nights were lengthening perceptibly. Already, each day occupied, maybe, some 2 hours from dawn to dusk. At night, I had been surprised to find that there were very few stars overhead, and these small, though of an extraordinary brightness, which I attributed to the peculiar but clear blackness of the night-time away to the north. I could discern a nebulous sort of mistiness, not unlike, in appearance, a small portion of the Milky Way. It might have been an extremely remote star cluster, or the thought came to me suddenly. Perhaps it was the sidereal universe that I had known, and now left far behind forever. A small, dimly glowing mist of stars, far in the depths of space. Still, the days and nights lengthened slowly. Each time the sun rose duller than it had set, and the dark belts increased in breadth. About this time, there happened a fresh thing. The sun, earth, and sky were suddenly darkened and apparently blotted out for a brief space. I had a sense, a certain awareness, I could learn little by sight, that the earth was enduring a very great fall of snow. Then, in an instant, the veil that had obscured everything vanished, and I looked out once more. A marvelous sight met my gaze. The hollow in which this house, with its gardens, stands, was brimmed with snow. 7. It lipped over the sill of my window. Everywhere it lay, a great level stretch of white, which caught and reflected, gloomily, the sombre coppery glows of the dying sun. The world had become a shadowless plain, from horizon to horizon. I glanced up at the sun. It shone with an extraordinary, dull clearness. I saw it now as one who, until then, had seen it only through a partially obscuring medium. All about it the sky had become black, with a clear, deep blackness, frightful in its nearness, and its unmeasured deep, and its utter unfriendliness. For a great time I looked into it, newly and shaken and fearful. It was so near. Had I been a child, I might have expressed some of my sensation and distress by saying that the sky had lost its roof. Later, I turned and peered about me into the room. Everywhere, it was covered with a thin shroud of the all-pervading white. I could see it but dimly, by reason of the sombre light that now lit the world. It appeared to cling to the ruined walls, and the thick, soft dust of the years that covered the floor knee-deep was nowhere visible. The snow must have blown in through the open framework of the windows. Yet in no place had it drifted, but lay everywhere about the great, old room, smooth and level. Moreover, there had been no wind these many thousand years, but there was the snow, as I have told, and all the earth was silent, and there was a cold such as no living man can ever have known. The earth was now illuminated by day with a most doleful light beyond my power to describe. It seemed as though I looked at the great plain through the medium of a bronze-tinted sea dot. It was evident that the earth's rotatory movement was departing steadily. The end came all at once. The night had been the longest yet, and when the dying sun showed, at last, above the world's edge, I had grown so wearied of the dark that I greeted it as a friend. It rose steadily until about 20 degrees above the horizon. Then it stopped suddenly, and after a strange retrograde movement, hung motionless, a great shield in the sky-line. Only the circular rim of the sun showed bright. Only this, and one thin streak of light near the equator gradually. Even this thread of light died out. And now all that was left of our great and glorious sun was a vast dead disk, rimmed with a thin circle of bronze-red light. Next chapter, chapter 18, The Green Star, the world was held in a savage gloom, cold and intolerable. Outside all was quiet, quiet. From the dark room behind me came the occasional soft thud-ten of falling matter, fragments of rotting stone. So time passed, and night grasped the world, wrapping it in wrappings of impenetrable blackness. There was no night sky as we know it. Even the few straggling stars had vanished, conclusively. I might have been in a shuttered room without a light, for all that I could see. Only in the impalpableness of gloom opposite burnt that vast, encircling hair of dull fire. Beyond this, there was no ray in all the vastitude of night that surrounded me, save that, far in the north, that soft, mist-like glow still shone silently. Years moved on. What period of time passed, I shall never know. It seemed to me, waiting there, that eternities came and went, stealthily, and still I watched. I could see only the glow of the sun's edge at times, for now it had commenced to come and go, lighting up a while and again becoming extinguished. All at once, during one of these periods of life, a sudden flame cut across the night, a quick glare that lit up the dead earth shortly, giving me a glimpse of its flat lonesomeness. The light appeared to come from the sun, shooting out from somewhere near its center diagonally. A moment I gazed, startled. Then the leaping flame sank and the gloom fell again. But now it was not so dark, and the sun was belted by a thin line of vivid white light. I stared intently. Had a volcano broken out on the sun? Yet I negatived the thought as soon as formed. I felt that the light had been far too intensely white and large for such a cause. Another idea there was that suggested itself to me. It was that one of the inner planets had fallen into the sun, becoming incandescent under that impact. This theory appealed to me as being more plausible and accounting more satisfactorily for the extraordinary size and brilliance of the blaze that had lit up the dead world, so unexpectedly full of interest and emotion. I stared across the darkness at that line of white fire cutting the night. One thing it told to me, unmistakably: the sun was yet rotating at an enormous speed. 11. Thus, I knew that the years were still fleeting at an incalculable rate, though so far as the earth was concerned, life and light and time were things belonging to a period lost in the long-gone ages. After that one burst of flame, the light had shone, only as an encircling band of bright fire. Now, however, as I watched, it began slowly to sink into a ruddy tint, and later to a dark copper-red color, much as the sun had done. Presently it sank to a deeper hue, and in a still further space of time it began to fluctuate, having periods of glowing and anon dying. Thus, after a great while, it disappeared. Long before this, the smouldering edge of the sun had deadened into blackness, and so, in that supremely future time, the world, dark and intensely silent, rode on its gloomy orbit around the ponderous mass of the dead sun. My thoughts at this period can be scarcely described. At first they were chaotic and wanting in coherence, but later, as the ages came and went, my soul seemed to imbibe the very essence of the oppressive solitude and dreariness that held the earth. With this feeling there came a wonderful clearness of thought, and I realized despairingly that the world might wander forever through that enormous night. For a while, the unwholesome idea filled me with a sensation of overbearing desolation, so that I could have cried like a child. In time, however, this feeling grew, almost insensibly less, and an unreasoning hope possessed me. Patiently I waited from time to time. The noise of dropping particles behind in the room came dully to my ears. Once I heard a loud crash and turned instinctively to look, forgetting for the moment the impenetrable night in which every detail was submerged. In a while my gaze sought the heavens, turning unconsciously toward the north. Yes, the nebulous glow still showed. Indeed, I could have almost imagined that it looked somewhat plainer. For a long time, I kept my gaze fixed upon it, feeling in my lonely soul that its soft haze was, in some way, a tie with the past. Strange, the trifles from which one can suck comfort. And yet, had I but known, but I shall come to that in its proper time. For a very long space I watched, without experiencing any of the desire for sleep that would so soon have visited me in the old earth days. How I should have welcomed it, if only to have passed the time away from my perplexities and thoughts. Several times, the comfortless sound of some great piece of masonry falling disturbed my meditations, and once it seemed I could hear whispering in the room behind me. Yet it was utterly useless to try to see anything. Such blackness as existed scarcely can be conceived. It was palpable and hideously brutal to the sense, as though something dead pressed up against me, something soft and icily cold under all this. There grew up within my mind a great and overwhelming distress of uneasiness that left me, but to drop me into an uncomfortable brooding. I felt that I must fight against it, and presently, hoping to distract my thoughts, I turned to the window and looked up toward the north in search of the nebulous whiteness, which still I believed to be the far and misty glowing of the universe we had left. Even as I raised my eyes, I was thrilled with a feeling of wonder, for now the hazy light had resolved into a single great star of vivid green. As I stared, astonished, the thought flashed into my mind that the earth must be traveling toward the star, not away as I had imagined. Next, that it could not be the universe the earth had left, but possibly an outlying star belonging to some vast star cluster hidden in the enormous depths of space. With a sense of commingled awe and curiosity, I watched it, wondering what new thing was to be revealed to me. For a while, vague thoughts and speculations occupied me, during which my gaze dwelt insatiably upon that one spot of light in the otherwise pit-like darkness. Hope grew up within me, banishing the oppression of despair that had seemed to stifle me. Wherever the earth was traveling, it was, at least, going once more toward the realms of light. Light. One must spend an eternity wrapped in soundless night to understand the full horror of being without it slowly. But surely the star grew upon my vision, until in time it shone as brightly as had the planet Jupiter in the old earth days. With increased size, its color became more impressive, reminding me of a huge emerald. Scintillating rays of fire across the world years fled away in silence, and the green star grew into a great splash of flame in the sky. A little later, I saw a thing that filled me with amazement. It was the ghostly outline of a vast crescent in the night, a gigantic new moon seeming to be growing out of the surrounding gloom. Utterly bemused, I stared at it. It appeared to be quite close, comparatively, and I puzzled to understand how the earth had come so near to it without my having seen it before. The light, thrown by the star, grew stronger, and presently I was aware that it was possible to see the earthscape again, though indistinctly. A while I stared, trying to make out whether I could distinguish any detail of the world's surface, but I found the light insufficient. In a little I gave up the attempt and glanced once more toward the star. Even in the short space that my attention had been diverted, it had increased considerably and seemed now, to my bewildered sight, about a quarter of the size of the full moon. The light it threw was extraordinarily powerful, yet its color was so abominably unfamiliar that such of the world as I could see showed unreal, more as though I looked out upon a landscape of shadow than aught else. All this time, the great crescent was increasing in brightness, and began now to shine with a perceptible shade of green. Steadily, the star increased in size and brilliancy until it showed, fully as large as half a full moon. And as it grew greater and brighter, so did the vast crescent throw out more and more light, though of an ever-deepening hue of green. Under the combined blaze of their radiances, the wilderness that stretched before me became steadily more visible. Soon, I seemed able to stare across the whole world, which now appeared beneath the strange light, terrible in its cold and awful, flat dreariness. It was a little later that my attention was drawn to the fact that the great star of green flame was slowly sinking out of the north toward the east. At first I could scarcely believe that I saw aright, but soon there could be no doubt that it was so. Gradually it sank, and as it fell, the vast crescent of glowing green began to dwindle and dwindle until it became a mere arc of light against the livid-colored sky. Later it vanished, disappearing in the self-same spot from which I had seen it slowly emerge. By this time, the star had come to within some 30 degrees of the hidden horizon. In size, it could now have rivaled the moon at its full, though even yet I could not distinguish its disk. This fact led me to conceive that it was, still, an extraordinary distance away, and this being so, I knew that its size must be huge, beyond the conception of man to understand or imagine. Suddenly, as I watched, the lower edge of the star vanished, cut by a straight, dark line. A minute or a century passed, and it dipped lower until the half of it had disappeared from sight. Far away out on the great plain, I saw a monstrous shadow blotting it out and advancing swiftly. Only a third of the star was visible now. Then, like a flash, the solution of this extraordinary phenomenon revealed itself to me. The star was sinking behind the enormous mass of the dead sun. Or rather, the sun, obedient to its attraction, was rising toward it, 12, with the earth following in its trail. As these thoughts expanded in my mind, the star vanished, being completely hidden by the tremendous bulk of the sun. Over the earth there fell, once more, the brooding night. With the darkness came an intolerable feeling of loneliness and dread. For the first time I thought of the pit and its inmates. After that, there rose in my memory the still more terrible thing that had haunted the shores of the Sea of Sleep and lurked in the shadows of this old building. Where were they? I wondered, and shivered with miserable thoughts. For a time, fear held me, and I prayed wildly and incoherently for some ray of light with which to dispel the cold blackness that enveloped the world. How long I waited, it is impossible to say, certainly for a very great period. Then all at once I saw a loom of light shine out ahead. Gradually it became more distinct, Suddenly, a ray of vivid green flashed across the darkness. At the same moment, I saw a thin line of livid flame far in the night. An instant, it seemed, and it had grown into a great clot of fire, beneath which the world lay bathed in a blaze of emerald green light. Steadily it grew until, presently, the whole of the green star had come into sight again. But now it could be scarcely called a star, for it had increased to vast proportions, being incomparably greater than the sun had been in the olden time. Then, as I stared, I became aware that I could see the edge of the lifeless sun, glowing like a great crescent moon. Slowly, its lighted surface broadened out to me until half of its diameter was visible, and the star began to drop away on my right. Time passed, and the earth moved on, slowly traversing the tremendous face of the dead sun. 13 gradually, as the earth travelled forward, the star fell still more to the right, until at last it shone on the back of the house, sending a flood of broken rays in through the skeleton-like walls. Glancing upward, I saw that much of the ceiling had vanished, enabling me to see that the upper stories were even more decayed. The roof had evidently gone entirely, and I could see the green effulgence of the starlight shining in, slantingly. And that concludes our reading of The House on the Borderland. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please give this video a like. Share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more free audiobooks. Don't forget the bell. Thanks for listening.